glad a few more people showed up. I asked Dorothy about 5 minutes before we started if she told everybody that I was speaking today, and she said, no, but the word got out. Anyway, for those of you that knew I was speaking and came anyway, thank you. And for those that didn't know, I'm sorry, but there are no refunds. So, during this month, we've invited speakers to discuss the creative processes, writing and painting, and the relationship to spirituality. I've long been thinking of trying my hand at discussing poetry, and I had to go out and get my anti-glare glasses. My working title, Poetry as Spiritual Practice, I got to tell you, was not immensely popular when I brought it up at the worship committee meeting. I didn't say poetry and prayer, but it came close, I think. Interestingly, we at the committee struggle with the definition of worship. And our chairperson, Dorothy Ward, asks every month for our definitions. The top choices every month are building a sense of community, providing inspiration for leading better lives, recharging our emotional, not spiritual, but emotional batteries. No one's ever said, praise the Almighty, go figure. But similarly, none of us mentioned an opportunity to develop a spiritual practice. We've never had, or at least not recently, an explicit conversation here on spiritual practice outside of meditation. Yet part of our mission statement pledges that we compassionately support each other in our spiritual searches. At the same time, it seems to me that searching isn't enough. One needs to put spirituality into practice. So, what are your spiritual practices? Meditation, affirmations, reading and study, singing? Everything that we do here on Sunday mornings? Certainly I do all of those. Well, not well, for instance, singing. But I consider them all spiritual practices. I also consider much of my life outside these walls to be spiritual practice. Hiking, photography, writing, service, simply the act of being courteous. Ralph Waldo Emerson, in his Divinity School address, and we can claim Emerson as a UU since he was a minister, insisted that spiritual practices not be limited to church services, but be sought and discovered firsthand. The doors of the temple stand open night and day before every man, and the oracles of this truth cease never. It is guided by one stern condition. This, namely, it is an intuition. It cannot be received at second hand. Robert McDowell is the author of Poetry as a Spiritual Practice. The book here that inspired this sermon writes, the point is, spiritual work is everywhere in our lives, not simply in the recitation of prayers and mantras. Spiritual practice is more than ritual. It's being in the wisdom moment when the mind and heart are wide open to learning and love. Creative acts, writing, painting, photography, architecture, composing, and of course playing music, building furniture, simply coloring in a book even, open the heart to learning and love. But so do listening to and viewing the creative fruits. And the subject today is poetry, opening our hearts to learning and love through poetry. Along the way, I hope that we will explore how poetry can build a feeling of community among us, inspire us to lead better lives, and bring us vicariously into communion not only with nature, but with all the rest of the world. Like Catherine Bauman, our speaker 2 weeks ago, I must confess that I have not been schooled in poetry. On the other hand, I've been both a lawyer and a reporter, and as such, I'm eminently qualified, in fact, doubly qualified, to speak on any subject regardless of the extent or lack of extent of my knowledge. Actually, two words come to mind when I think of poetry: mysterious and intimidating. Through much of my life, poetry has been very intimidating to me. So has art and art history. I've always found it difficult to understand. I've never been able to remember the distinctions between sonnets and couplets. I still strive like the devil to capture the cadence of Shakespeare. It eludes me almost as much as the ability to sing on key. What I lacked, I have a standing joke that my family asked me not to sing at birthday parties. What I lacked was a mentor. And I have to ask, how many of you can say that you had a teacher or parent who introduced you to the beautiful world of poetry? Unfortunately, a real minority. Schools barely touch on it unless you take a specialized course in college. Furthermore, I've always been afraid of seeming to be pretentious, a pretentious fool, missing the meaning or message intended by the author, losing the rhythm, and even mispronouncing a key word. And I'm not alone. Not all poets are easy to understand. Mark Twain, a reasonably good poet himself, once suggested that if you want to appear knowledgeable, you attribute all the poetry that you can't understand to Emerson. Now, I've always thought that I needed to study poetry and art in general to understand it, much as I would seek to understand a foreign language, and that I needed to understand it well in order to enjoy it, to delight in its beauty. Maxine Kumin, in a poem entitled A Calling, discussed the words of painter Georgia O'Keeffe. One works, I supposed, because it is the most interesting thing one knows to do. And Kumin wrote, "Poetry is like farming. It's a calling. It needs constancy, the deep woods, drumming of the grouse, and long life, like George's, who is talking to one, talking to me, talking to you." So there we have it. O'Keeffe could be talking to me, but I was afraid I wouldn't understand what she was saying. Turns out that I may have been looking in the wrong direction for meaning. In 1927, E. E. Cummings discussed the artistic value of a painting as understood by a hypothetical illiterate peasant. It is art because it is alive. It proves that if you and I are to create at all, we must create with today, and let all the art schools and Medicis in the universe go hang themselves with yesterday's rope. It teaches us that we have made a profound error in trying to learn art, since whatever art stands for is whatever cannot be learned. Indeed, the artist is no other than he who unlearns what he has learned in order to know himself. And the agony of the artist, far from being the result of the world's failure to discover and appreciate him, arises from his own personal struggle to discover, to appreciate, and finally to express himself. Look into yourself, reader, for you must find art there, if at all. Julia Cameron, author of The Artist's Way, A Spiritual Path to Higher Creativity, echoes Cummings' words. The quality of life is in proportion always to the capacity for delight. The capacity for delight is the gift of paying attention. Poetry, well used, is perfect for helping me to pay attention. McDowell points out, it is poetry that most deliciously sharpens the senses, heightening awareness and presence in the moment. Part of that ability to heighten awareness of the moment is the distillation process that goes into most poetry. To quote Twain again, what a lumbering poor vehicle prose is for the conveying of a great thought. Prose wanders around with a lantern and laboriously schedules and verifies the details and particulars of a valley and its frame of crags and peaks. Then poetry comes and lays bare the whole landscape with a single splendid flash. But there is something more for a spiritual experience to occur. A connection with something outside of us. For this I originally wrote something greater than ourselves, but that's not really true. The connection can be as simple as a shared experience, a shared fear, or a shared loss. And that is where we find our sense of community. It is that connection with something outside of us that creates an insight, Twain's sudden flash, opening our hearts and minds to learning and love. None of this means that the only valid meaning or interpretation of poetry will be found or felt without knowledge. In the past, actually, almost constantly, I'm accused of overanalyzing, and that may be my nature. But how, I think, can I share an experience, a fear, or a loss with the poet without knowing something about him or her? And how can I share anything by a quick reading of a poem, hoping that insight will leap from the page and grab me around the neck? Sometime back, I discovered this short poem by Eve Merriam that has proved to be an inspiration for me. It's called How to Eat a Poem. Don't be polite. Bite in. Pick it up with your fingers and lick the juice that may run down your chin. It is ready and ripe now, whenever you are. You do not need a knife or fork or spoon or plate or napkin or tablecloth, for there is no core or stem or rind or pit or seed or skin to throw away. So, let me feast with you on two poems, one of which is likely to be quite familiar to you. The first is Invictus, a 19th century Victorian poem by William Ernest Hensley, later to become editor of Great Britain's National Observer. And I think it was Donis Deaver who a couple of years ago read this at a poetry service that we had. Out of the night that covers me, black as the pit from pole to pole, I thank whatever gods may be for my unconquerable soul. In the fell clutch of circumstance, I have not winced nor cried aloud. Under the bludgeonings of chance, my head is bloody but unbowed. Beyond this place of wrath and tears looms but the horror of the shade, and yet the menace of the years finds and shall find me unafraid. It matters not how strait the gate, how charged with punishments the scroll. I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul. It's powerful, right? A man standing up to everything that life has to throw at him. You have an image of a man in front of a mast, waves breaking over him, right? That's what you get? Now, let's really bite into this poem. It might help to know that the title, Invictus, which means unconquered, was given to this poem not by the author, but by the editor of the Oxford Book of English Verse in 1902, just a year before Henley's death of tuberculosis. It's unlikely that he ever even knew of that title. The poem was written in 1875, when Henley was 26, and at the end of a 3-year stay in a tuberculosis hospital. Henley, as a teenager, already had lost one leg below the knee. He underwent extensive surgery to his other foot during those 3 years in order to save his remaining leg. Later in life, Henley was known for his broad shoulders, his full red beard, his crutch, and his sense of humor and laugh. His friend, Robert Louis Stevenson, modeled Long John Silver in Treasure Island after him. Another friend, Auguste Rodin, sculpted the bust that graces his grave. Although best known for this one poem, Henley published several books, critical reviews, and 3 plays, all coming from a boy who grew up with an impoverished childhood. Did he display courage in his lifetime? Yes. Perseverance? Absolutely. But isn't it just a little arrogant to think about writing of courage in the first person? Henley wasn't known as an arrogant man. He probably was best loved for his support of other artists, such as Rodin and Whistler, and writers. It's hard to believe that Henley would have sanctioned Unconquered for the title of that poem, even if he had known of it. It also might help to know that when this poem was published without a title, it appeared in a chapter on death and dying in a collection called simply Book of Verses. So let me read this again with a little different interpretation, a different voice, and the thought that this poem is written in the first person by someone actually dying. In the first line, out of the night that covers me. Thankful, a person who is thankful for the gift of a soul that would survive any life on this earth. A person who is approaching the shade, that division between life and death, and facing the gates of heaven and the book of judgments. And think of all of those are elements in this poem as I read it the second time. Also think of what is probably the most distinguishing characteristic shared by ship's captains. What would that be? Anyone have an idea?
Authority.
Think about authority, not authority.
Tenacity?
What?
Tenacity?
Yeah, there we go. It's personal responsibility, the acceptance of personal responsibility. The captain has the authority. The captain also has a navigator in which that he or she is hired and that provides guidance, in which the captain supposedly has faith. That'll be a metaphor for another sermon perhaps. But the captain depends on his entire crew. At the end, though, if there's a mistake made, and it doesn't matter who makes it, it's the captain who has to take personal responsibility because he has made each decision while guiding that ship. So think about that. And of course, what Gudrun stated, the captain traditionally goes down with his ship. One more thing, note that a colon, not a comma, divides the last 2 lines. Small point, but actually kind of important. I am the captain of my soul does not merely repeat the meaning of the prior line. It tells you what the speaker means by the prior line. Out of the night that covers me, black as the pit from pole to pole, I thank whatever gods may be for my unconquerable soul. In the fell clutch of circumstance, I have not winced nor cried aloud. Under the bludgeonings of chance, my head is bloody, but unbowed. Beyond this place of wrath and tears looms but the horror of the shade. And yet the menace of the years finds and shall find me unafraid. It matters not how strait the gate, how charged with punishments the scroll. I am the master of my fate, I'm the captain of my soul. This is, in my interpretation, a poem about a story of a person dying and willing to take personal responsibility for the decisions that he's made in his life, the things that he's done. And it doesn't matter what happens to be on the scroll that he's going to face or may face. It's inspirational for me because I have a tendency, I think like many people, to rationalize, to explain and to shift blame to others when I've made mistakes. The inspiration then from this poem is not to face each day ready for battle. It's that I must, whether at the end of my life or at the end of each day, accept personal responsibility for my decisions, my words, and my actions, regardless of the consequences. So let's devour another poem, though, shall we? This time we'll begin with history. Jean-Antoine Watteau, French artist who died in 1721 at the age of 36. And a story of art, inspiring art, inspiring art. Watteau never had aristocratic patrons. His customers, being mostly among the merchant and bourgeois classes, he had to depend upon them for buying his paintings. And nonetheless, many of his paintings depicted the frivolous parties of the idle rich, the Paris Hiltons and Kim Kardashians of the day, including common pastimes, such as being entertained by the Commedia dell'arte, who were traveling improvisational actors, typically performing in costume and masks, doing the Bergamasque, a peasant dance from northern Italy, singing and playing a French version of the lute. His settings tended to be melancholy and formal, suggesting the emptiness of life, with statuary and fountains one might see in a tomb or in a graveyard, as well as in an aristocrat's estate. And let me turn this light. The one image I want to show, if you can see this. This is a painting by Watteau. And if you can see it, and I wish I could get the full frame, you can see it, you can see the various elements that I've just talked about. They're masked characters down here. People singing, also are playing instruments up here in masks. Those would be the major people. A couple doing the Bergamasque, a couple playing the statuary, a water fountain back here, a water jet. In 1869, some 150 years later, the French poet Paul Verlaine, inspired by Watteau's work, and quite possibly this piece, wrote this poem, which I'm going to read in English translation. Your soul is a chosen landscape, where charming masqueraders and bergamaskers go, playing the lute and dancing, and almost sad beneath their fanciful disguises. All sing, but in a minor key, of victorious love and the opportune life. They do not seem to believe in their happiness, and their song mingles with the moonlight, with the still moonlight, sad and beautiful, that sets the birds dreaming in the trees and the fountains sobbing in ecstasy. The tall, slender fountains among marble statues. I know why this seems empty. I missed a whole page.
What?
Oh, yeah. Okay. Verlaine titled his poem Moonlight, Clair de Lune. And of course, the poem inspired Claude Debussy to compose his music of the same name 35 years later. It was intended to evoke the same feelings of melancholy, moonlight, sad and beautiful, regarding the emptiness of life. It seemed to have been a common theme of Watteau's. This feeling of emptiness, specifically of spiritual emptiness, is a common theme of poets. It seems as if most of us experience that feeling of emptiness, sometimes a large hole, sometimes small, at some point in our lives, or perhaps during our entire lives. The purpose of poetry is to evoke feelings, and with good reason. In Maya Angelou's words, I've learned that people will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel. Both Verlaine and Henley specifically mention the soul in regard to feelings. For Emerson and the Transcendentalists, the soul consisted of everything outside material existence, and the way to connect with that soul, in their opinion, was through nature. In his essay of that name, Emerson argued, why should not we also enjoy an original relation to the universe? Why should not we have a poetry and philosophy of insight and not of tradition, and a religion by revelation to us, and not the history of theirs? Embosomed for a season in nature, whose floods of life stream around and through us, and invite us by the powers they supply to action proportioned to nature, why should we grope among the dry bones of the past, or put the living generation into masquerade out of its faded wardrobe? The sun shines today also. There is more wool and flax in the fields. There are new lands, new men, new thoughts. Let us demand our own works and laws and worship. Sometime last year, I researched the author of responsive reading that we had during the service. The author was Mary Oliver. I discovered the richness and depth of her poetry. I also happened on this neat little book of hers, Understanding, it's a guide to understanding and writing poetry. It's called the Poetry Handbook. Now, I still can't give the definitions of sonnet and couplet right off the cuff, but at least I know that they refer to two entirely different properties of a poem, which is a start. Mary Oliver is a Unitarian in the tradition of Emerson and Thoreau, but much more accessible and intelligible. She writes frequently of her yearning for something that seems to lie just outside her grasp. Robert Frost, too, wrote of those glimpses of something just outside his past. Heaven gives its glimpses only to those not in a position to look too close. I've enjoyed many poets over the last couple of years, but Mary Oliver in particular calls to me, and I try to listen. Part of my spiritual practice each morning is to read one. By the way, I should mention that my spiritual practice also includes 2 good cups of coffee. But I read just one, of her poems each day. I parse it. I read it with a marker, a highlighter, and a pen. I let the juice, actually I devour it in short. I let the juice run down my chin. And I think it's a great way to start the day. In fact, this book, most of my books are in better shape. It's all written up, it's highlighted. This is my book. I've made it mine. Very proud of it. It got waterlogged when I shoved it into this pulpit a few weeks ago, a couple months ago. There was a glass of water in there. But I want to mention just a few of her gems. In Quiet Happenings, she describes looking out a window from her writing desk at what she terms a morning glory morning, and a field of flowers, each one fresh and almost, but not quite, replicable. Consider wearing such a satisfying body. Consider being with your entire self such a quiet prayer. And in one titled Little Summer Poem, touching the subject of faith, she writes of watching corn, not seeing it growing, but having faith that it is beyond all seeable proof or hearable hum, and therefore let the immeasurable come. Let the unknowable touch the buckle of my spine. Let the wind turn in the trees, and the mystery hidden in dirt swing through the air. One morning, in the leafy green ocean, the honeycomb of the corn's beautiful body is sure to be there. So, I've come to the end of my time, I think, or I can see, but not the end of this subject. As part of your spiritual practice, I urge you to pick up a volume of poetry. Don't read it cover to cover. Pick a poem, only one, at random every day. Bite into it. Let the juice run down your chin, and don't waste any of it. Thank you.
Thank you, Terry. Okay, please stand now as you are willing and able for our closing hymn, number 326, Let All the Beauty We Have Known. Join together and read our West Valley UU mission statement, which is in the order of service. We agree to provide a safe place to celebrate diversity, draw inspiration for living better lives, foster social and environmental justice, and compassionately support each other in our spiritual searches. And Terry will now offer some closing words.
And these from Mary Oliver's poem, Such Singing in the Wild Branches. The closing lines. Listen, everyone has a chance, but spring, is it spring? Is it morning? Are there trees near you, and does your own soul need comforting? Quick then, open the door and fly on your heavy feet. The song may already be drifting away.
Thank you to all who served this morning, Barbara and Nancy for being greeters, and Joe, our wonderful musician, and Terry for his wonderful words.
Well, don't hurt it.